This recording is going to cover somatic reflexes. So somatic reflexes encompass reflexes that the effectors are skeletal muscle. Now I do want to kind of briefly discuss other reflexes just as an overview. Is you have reflexes that are either somatic or visceral based on what the effector is. So we're going to look at somatic reflexes, so skeletal muscles involved. Visceral or autonomic reflexes, the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle glands, those are going to be the effectors, but this is the one that we're going to talk about. We will give you examples today of monosynaptic versus polysynaptic, how complex the circuit is. Is there only one synapse involved? Another way of saying it, there is no interneuron involved. Your afferent will synapse directly with the efferent neuron. Polysynaptic, there will be interneurons involved. So the example the only example of a monosynaptic reflex that you're going to see is the stretch reflex. Everything else are polysynaptic. But I'm also going to give you a couple examples of some cranial reflexes. Cranial reflexes, the integration center is going to be within the brainstem. The other reflexes that I'll give you will be spinal reflexes, so they're going to be completely processed within the spinal cord. So kind of just do a quick overview of your basic components of reflexes. So remember, you always have a sensory receptor. Could be a tactile receptor, a pain receptor, some sort of sensory receptor. That information is going to be carried along an afferent neuron, remember, is a sensory neuron, to the central nervous system. The central nervous system, the integration center, could be the spinal cord if it was a spinal reflex like you see in the picture, or it could be in the brainstem. So it's going to be within the gray matter one way or the other, gray matter of the spinal cord or within the brainstem. Then this is where the processing takes place. Okay, what do we need to do in response to this particular stimulus? We will have to cause a response in a motor neuron. So the motor neuron is going to be carrying that efferent information, it's the efferent neuron, to the effector. In this case, it's a skeletal muscle, and it's going to cause that skeletal muscle to contract, for example. So you have your 5 basic components. Now we'll come back to that. So cranial reflexes, here the integration center is going to be within the brainstem. The spinal reflexes is within the spinal cord. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of cranial reflexes. First one's the corneal reflex. This is an important reflex because it protects your eyes against foreign objects. So a way they can test it is they can touch your cornea with like a cotton ball, cotton applicator, and generally if something touches your cornea, you're automatically going to reflexively blink or close your eye. They also call it a blink reflex. So it's protective. There are more than one cranial nerve that's involved in the corneal reflex. Now here, this is a picture of someone trying to elicit the corneal reflex because they're trying to evaluate the function of a couple of these cranial nerves that they know they're involved in it. Is the sensory information is, actually I'm going to do this one, sensory information is going to be carried along your ophthalmic branch of your trigeminal nerve. So remember, trigeminal nerve has 3 branches. Ophthalmic here, which is V1. You have maxillary branch, which is V2. And you have your mandibular branch, which is V3. So the sensory information is carried along the first branch of your trigeminal nerve, or your ophthalmic branch. That's going to be carried to your pons, where we have integration. So that's in your brainstem. And it's the facial nerve, and it's actually these 2 branches of the facial nerve that innervate the orbicularis oculi. So orbicularis oculi muscle, which the effect is for you to close your eye. And if I come back to this picture, is something touches your cornea, the information is going to say they touched your right cornea. The information is going to be carried along the ophthalmic branch of your trigeminal nerve. But what you'll notice is on this picture, you see both eyes, efferent information, going to both eyes, and actually it's an example of a consensual reflex, where you have a stimulus on one side, but both sides are going to be affected. So you think, just think about it, that someone that touched you in your right eye, both eyes actually close. So it's kind of a cool type of reflex. Now the next reflex I'm going to look at is called your gag reflex, also referred to as your pharyngeal reflex. So if you touch the back of your tongue, back of your throat, your uvula, which is this little dangly thing here, back by your tonsils, it triggers gagging or retching in some cases. Some people's gag reflex is very sensitive. What ultimately happens is that your soft palate elevates and then your pharyngeal muscles contract and you kind of gag. It's protective reflex. It helps to protect against choking. Some people's gag reflex is very sensitive, hypersensitive, and that's actually something that people have to realize, that if you go into dentistry, dental hygiene, there are some people with very strong gag reflexes. It's kind of hard to work with people in their mouth if they're going to be trying to gagging on you every time you're trying to work in their mouth. So I found this picture of the snake. It's a stupid gag reflex. So you notice the picture's taking place in a dentist's office, and they even have classes, people who are going into dentistry, dental hygiene, they have to somehow figure out how to manage patients with very hypersensitive gag reflexes, because it's hard to work on them if they've got very hypersensitive gag reflexes. That gag reflex, I did notice, was very sensitive when I was pregnant. I don't know the exact mechanism why that came about, but there are a lot of pregnant women who have very exaggerated gag reflexes when they're pregnant. Actually, what I remember is that the corneal reflex, that can actually be diminished if you're a contact lens wearer, because think about it, you got something on top of your cornea all the time, so over time that reflex can actually be diminished if you wear contacts, just so you can kind of keep that in mind. Now, for the gag reflex, the afferent information, the sensory information, is carried along your glossopharyngeal nerve, because it has the innervation in those areas in the back of your throat. However, the motor information, the pharyngeal muscles that cause you to gag, is actually the efferents is carried along the vagus nerve. So that's going to innervate the areas, the pharyngeal muscles, and cause you to actually gag. In this instance, for this reflex, the integration center, again, is since it's a cranial reflex, is in the brainstem. It's actually within the medulla oblongata. Now what I do is I'm going to talk about spinal reflexes. So here are the integration centers within the spinal cord. And we're going to be looking at a number of different reflexes. So first one I want to look at is called the FLEXOR withdrawal reflex. Now this one is an example of a polysynaptic reflex, because there's more than one synapse involved, and I'm going to show it to you. It's also referred to as an ipsilateral reflex. The reason why it's ipsilateral, so if you touch your right finger on a hot flame, the muscles that will be involved, which will be your flexor muscles, will be on the same side. You're going to withdraw on the same side of where the stimulus was. So that's ipsilateral. So this picture kind of shows you why it's polysynaptic. You notice there's more than one synapse involved. There's one here, there's one here. So you notice the white is an interneuron. So this is a little bit more complicated circuit. Now with this one, the stimulus is a painful stimulus. So the receptor is a nociceptor. So the pain information is going to be carried along the afferent neuron to the dorsal gray horn of the spinal cord. In the dorsal gray horn of the spinal cord is where you're going to have the cell bodies of those interneurons that are involved in somatic sensory information. That interneuron is actually, you'll notice on the picture, branches. So we're going to just look at the one first. Is this interneuron here is then going to synapse with the cell body of what we refer to as an alpha motor neuron. The cell bodies of alpha motor neurons are located in the anterior gray horns of the spinal cord. Now these alpha motor neurons will innervate skeletal muscle. So those axons go out the ventral root, through the ventral ramus, eventually to where we need it. In this case, it's going to be the flexor muscles of the arm, because they call it the flexor withdrawal reflex. So if I put my hand on attack, I want to trigger the contraction of flexor muscles on the same side, so ultimately I'll withdraw from the painful stimulus. It's protective. So so they call it the flexor withdrawal reflex. Now what happens at the synapse down here between the alpha motor neuron and the muscle is acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter involved in that. And that triggers the contraction of the flexor muscles and withdrawal of the limb. Now over here on this picture, I do want to bring your attention to where you see how this branch of this interneuron crossed over and then ascended along the lateral white column. So at some point in time, you're aware that that stimulus was painful, but you've already withdrawn from that painful stimulus even before that you knew that it hurt. But that these collaterals are carrying information to the brain, and you'll notice this information is going to be carried along the lateral spinal thalamic tract up to the brain, and it's going to be interpreted in that primary somatosensory cortex on the opposite side. Now the crossed extensor reflex is a reflex that's actually initiated at the same time as the flexor withdrawal reflex. This also is polysynaptic, because you'll notice there's interneurons involved, and but it's contralateral. Okay, it's not ipsilateral, it's contralateral. So you notice on this depiction, the flexor withdrawal reflex is, you have flexor withdrawal reflex initiated in the left leg because someone stepped on attack on their left foot. But the crossed extensor reflex is, you'll see in the opposite side, the right leg was affected. And so that's why they call it contralateral. And it's, the cross kind of tells you it crosses. And in this case, the extensor muscles are involved. So we have someone stepping on attack with their left foot. The sensor information is carried to the spinal cord, again to the dorsal gray horn of the spinal cord. And you have an interneuron, and where I have actually right there, that is an excitatory interneuron. This is also an excitatory interneuron, so I'm going to label that. An excitatory interneuron means this is going to be releasing an excitatory neurotransmitter that will cause excitation as a result of it. So here, this was excitatory, here's excitatory, and actually they release a neurotransmitter called glutamate. That's excitatory. That will lead to generation of action potentials, and the information is going to be carried along those neurons. In this case, here's the alpha motor neuron to the hamstrings, which were flexor muscles in this case, on this scenario. You get that flexor withdrawal reflex, but with a crossed extensor reflex, here, right here, is the alpha motor neuron to the extensor muscles of the legs, which are the muscles of the anterior thigh, your quadriceps groups, your rectus femoris muscle, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis. So this, what happens is, again, acetylcholine is going to be released at the neuromuscular junction and cause contraction of that muscle. So with the cross extensor reflex, you have the same stimulus as the flexor withdrawal. You had a painful stimulus. But what happens is we're going to get crossing over at the level of the spinal cord, and then we're going to have the extensor muscles on the opposite side contract. But what you'll notice in this picture, it's like I drew some extra stuff in there, so I'm going to just erase this so you can see it better, is I'm going to color in gold. Right here is this here in gold is an inhibitory interneuron. So it must release an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which is not going to lead to excitation, it leads to inhibition. So what happens is, when you want extension of the opposite leg, you do not want the flexor muscles, in this case the hamstrings, to contract. And so here, you're ensuring that these muscles here will not contract. And the neurotransmitter released here, that point there, is actually glycine. Because if you think about it, if the extensors in that right leg contract, it's going to lead to stretching of the hamstrings, which could lead to a reflex contraction of those muscles. And that's going to be something we talk about when we talk about the stretch reflex. So we want to make sure those hamstrings don't oppose what's going on with the quadricep muscle group. So that's your crossed extensor reflex. Now the last reflex I want to discuss is the stretch reflex. Now the stretch reflex is an important reflex. It goes on all the time. You don't even think about it. We demonstrate it in lab by doing the knee jerk reflex. You tap the patellar tendon. What happens is you get extension of that leg. They use that to evaluate spinal cord function of the various nerves that are involved. But this is a reflex that's going on all the time. You just don't even think about it. So like if you're trying to carry something on a tray and then all of a sudden throw something on it, like a weight, that reflex is actually going to kick in to keep you be able to keep holding that tray and not having that tray fall down. So the stretch reflex is actually fairly important in just posture and balance and that type of stuff. Now this reflex is monosynaptic. There's no interneuron involved in the actual result of contraction of the muscle that we're going to look at. It is ipsilateral. So if I stretch the muscle in the left leg, the muscle in the left leg is going to be the one that contracts. And so with a stretch reflex, we have stretch of something leads to contraction of that same muscle group that was stretched. So here, the sensoriceptor is actually a muscle spindle. The muscle spindle is found as part of what we call intrafusal muscle fibers. So intrafusal muscle fibers found deep within that muscle. Here, when you think muscle, when I talk about muscles to you, what I'm referring to is extrafusal muscle fibers. Those are the ones that when they contract, they cause like your leg to move. But within the intrafusal fibers, that's where you find the sensoriceptor. It responds to changes in muscle length. You stretch a muscle, that's going to trigger action potentials. The ultimate result of it will be cause contraction of the muscle. And on this picture, you'll notice here's the sensory neuron. It directly synapses with the motor neuron. So there is no interneuron involved. It is monosynaptic. So this picture kind of shows you a little bit better view of the muscle spindle. So here the muscle spindle is within the intrafusal muscle fibers, and out here is the extrafusal muscle fibers. Now, one thing to note is extrafusal muscle fibers are innervated by alpha motor neurons. So they're the ones that release acetylcholine and cause contraction of the muscle. Gamma motor neurons, you see right here, gamma motor neurons, they're going to be involved in, actually, I'll draw it over here, it's right there. So the green is the alpha motor neuron innervating the extrafusal muscle fibers. Gamma motor neurons actually innervate the ends of the muscle spindle. Muscle spindles were derived from muscle, but they've lost most of their contractile elements. So they're purely sensory, except the very ends of it. And that's going to be important. So if you stretch a muscle spindle, the sensory information is going to the central nervous system. But we're going to show you at the same time when the skeletal muscle is triggered to contract, we're also going to track the ends of the muscle spindle. And there's going to be a reason for that. So I'm going to show you. So here is a muscle that's relaxed, normal. And this is indicating frequency of action potentials. You stretch it. Look what happens to the frequency of action potentials if you stretch it. Muscle spindle is a mechanoreceptor. And when you stretch it, you increase the permeability to ions. And so the frequency of action potentials is going to increase. If you contract that muscle, the frequency decreases. So what happens as a result of increased action potential frequency coming from the muscle spindle? So if you notice on this picture, is if you stretch the muscle right there, here you see the frequency increases. It says muscle tone increases. So if you stretch a muscle, the ultimate result would cause that muscle to contract. So they say muscle tone increases. If you compress a muscle, it's contracting. The frequency, you're not stretching it, is less, muscle tone decreases. So it's detecting changes within the muscle length and sending that information to the central nervous system. An ultimate result is to change the muscle tone. Now what happens is, what would happen if you have activation of alpha motor neurons only, is here within the muscle spindle, if you contract that muscle spindle is going to be become lax. And in order for it to be sensitive again, you're going to have to really stretch a lot more for it to pick up that you're stretching the muscle more. And so what happens is you want to have alpha and gamma coactivation. You want gamma motor neurons to be activated at the same time as alpha motor neurons. And I had mentioned is the gamma motor neurons are the ones that innervate the ends of the muscle spindle. So it keeps this tight. And so that if you stretch it some more, it can stay sensitive. So the importance of having alpha gamma coactivation is that the muscle spindle can retain its sensitivity no matter what length you're putting at, because the ultimate result would be cause that muscle contract, which would make that muscle spindle become loose and not tight anymore. And so we want to make sure it maintains its sensitivity. So we have what we call alpha gamma coactivation. And I'll show you a video, a little animation of it in class to illustrate what happens with it. So I'm going to use the knee jerk reflex to kind of illustrate that stretch reflex. And so with the knee jerk reflex, you tap the patellar tendon with the reflex hammer. What happens is it actually stretches, because the patellar tendon is attached to the quadricep muscle group. It stretches that muscle. And so here is the muscle spindle. So muscle spindle is stretched. Sensory information carrying along the sensory neuron. You'll notice right here where it says number 1, it directly synapses with the alpha motor neuron located in that anterior gray horn of the spinal cord that then innervates the quadricep group, the same muscle group that was stretched. The end result is to cause contraction of the quadriceps, and you see extension of the knee. Okay? But what you'll notice is at the same time, we have branches of that sensory neuron. And we have one that comes here, and you have in red, you have an interneuron that's illustrated in red. This is actually an inhibitory interneuron. That at the same time as the quadriceps contract, we're going to have inhibition of the hamstrings, because that's the flexor muscles of the leg. So if I contract the quadriceps, it will stretch the hamstrings, which would trigger another reflex, and it'd keep me from extending my knee. So what I want to do is, if I stretch the quadriceps, I want to make sure the hamstrings, the flexors, don't counteract that effect. And so you have inhibition of the hamstring muscles. And again, the inhibitory interneuron right here is releasing glycine. But you'll also notice on this picture, we have this information going up this way, is you have collaterals, and remember at some point you know that someone tapped you on the knee in this case. And so that information is carried along the fasciculus gracilis tract up to the primary somatosensory cortex. So it's showing you a number of different pathways. But because it's a reflex, it's a spinal reflex, you had extension of the knee even before you knew someone actually tapped you on the knee. So it happens that quickly because it's processed within the spinal cord. So gray matter of the spinal cord is your integration center. Your sensory neuron, or your sensory receptor, is the muscle spindle. You have your sensory neuron. You have your integration center we had mentioned. Your efferent neuron that goes to the skeletal muscle, in this case, because it's the knee jerk reflex, it's the quadricep muscle group. that's your effectors quadricep muscle group. So that's just giving you an example of the knee jerk reflex. Now this is often used clinically to evaluate functioning of the spinal cord, the lumbar spinal cord, because this is where it's going to be processed. If you have problems with the femoral nerve, you have problems with the dorsal root ganglion or the ventral root, that could affect your knee jerk reflex because all of those parts are involved in this particular reflex. Knee jerk or reflexes also can be not only diminished, but they can be exaggerated if you have upper motor neuron disease. So you do have some inhibition from higher brain centers for some of these reflexes, and if there's problems with some of these descending tracts, that you could have exaggerated reflexes in upper motor neuron disease. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in class, so if you have any questions, you need to bring them.